Hey everybody, it's Shaman Sister Sin, and you are listening to Notorious Narcissists, a podcast dedicated to examining notable narcissistic psychopaths, serial killers, mass killers, cult leaders, and other historical or public figures. Today we're going to look at notorious serial killer, necrophile, and cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer. From 1978 to 1991, Dahmer hunted young men in the greater Milwaukee area. He was almost caught numerous times and truly seemed to have the luck of the devil. He went from rape to murder to the unthinkable. In July 1991, intended victim Tracy Edwards escaped and flagged down law enforcement. Dahmer was arrested, and the full extent of his crimes was revealed to the public for the first time. Dahmer pleaded guilty but insane to 15 counts of murder, though he actually admitted to 17 murders in total. The courts disagreed with this plea, and Dahmer was found sane and responsible for his crimes. He was sentenced to life in prison. The death penalty was not an option because it has been outlawed in Wisconsin since 1853. In November of 1994, Dahmer was killed by another inmate at Columbia Correctional Institution. This was after he had requested to be taken out of the protective custody unit and put into the general population. Jeffrey Dahmer is one of those people who personifies serial murder in the minds of many, many people. The things he did were so twisted, so outside of normal human understanding that people simply cannot wrap their minds around why somebody does something like that. And that's what we're going to discuss here. To begin with, Dahmer was most definitely a narcissist. He was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder during his trial and antisocial personality disorders. This means that he is also a psychopath. As listeners of my other podcast know, all psychopaths are narcissists, though not all narcissists are psychopaths. Interestingly, Dahmer was also diagnosed with psychotic disorders, but this might have been because people don't always understand the way that extreme narcissism can present itself in people. It's not uncommon for them to seem delusional or out of touch with reality, especially regarding their magical thinking and their paranoia. They are not living in actuality, you might say, but they are not psychotic, as Dahmer obviously was not. He was clearly able to understand and appreciate the nature of his crimes, and clearly able to convince the police on more than one occasion that everything was fine. He even talked them into releasing an already injured victim back into his custody. He doesn't appear to have been psychotic at any time. He knew what he was doing was wrong, terrible, and illegal. He just didn't care. What he wanted was more important. Now, many people hear something like this and they think, well, whoever did that had to be crazy. That's not true. Some people who do things like what Dahmer did are psychotic and delusional, but many of them are not. Most of them are not, actually, because the ones who are usually not able to kill multiple victims over long periods of time. They're too disordered to hide anything, and they're usually caught pretty quickly. These people often don't even realize they've done something wrong. They might be seen walking away from the murder scene with blood all over them, as was the case with Richard Chase, or carrying the victim's head around in public and talking to it, as was the case with a psychotic man who murdered his newlywed wife after hearing voices that he believed came from 10 men that she was cheating on him with. Dahmer often gets a rep as a sympathetic killer, with people feeling sorry for him because, by his own admission, he killed people because he wanted them to stay with him. However, if we actually look at his actions, we see that all is not what it seems. When a non-narcissistic person hears this explanation, they conclude that he was lonely and he wanted love and he's looking for someone to be with him and a partner. This may in fact be true by whatever standards those words apply to a psychopath. But what people are actually seeing is their own humanity reflected back to them, because his behavior is not the behavior born of needing love or companionship. It's ownership. He was not interested in companionship or a relationship. He wanted power and control over other people, and that's all. This is a man who did everything he could to literally erase what made his victims who they are. He drilled holes in their heads and poured boiling water or acid onto their brains in the hope of doing like a homemade lobotomy, so that he would essentially have a warm cadaver, something that breathed and lived but was not a person. A living doll, in other words. In his interviews with FBI profiler Robert Ressler, Dahmer was asked what his ideal romantic situation would be. He responded that he wanted a person with absolutely no needs or wants of their own, who would exist only to satisfy him when he wanted them to do so. They would not leave or go to work or do anything at all, and they would never need anything from him ever. If he couldn't have that, he would take what he had been doing, which was drugging people and killing them, trying to create the zombie robot sex partners. A normal relationship of any kind was not discussed or even mentioned in this conversation. Dahmer certainly could have had a relationship if he'd wanted one. He had no trouble getting people to go with him, getting men to come to his house with him. He obviously did not want a normal relationship. That's not what he wanted. This is not a person, then, who understood that other people are human beings in any way. He viewed them as objects only. His ideal, quote, relationship was no relationship at all. The other person was simply a receptacle, an object he could use to give himself pleasure. Perhaps more blatantly than other serial murderers, Dahmer was separated from his humanity. For example, Dahmer was not considered a sadist, and people often take that to mean he didn't want to hurt anybody. It does not mean that. It means that hurting people was not his goal. Unlike John Gacy, for example, who needed to cause the maximum amount of suffering to his victims in order to be satisfied. But this is easy to misinterpret when you're looking at it through the lens of your own humanity. People often think, okay, well, if someone doesn't want to hurt somebody, they must care. It is not compassion that made Dahmer not sadistic. It was indifference. The suffering of the victim didn't matter to him either way. It's the same with drugging the victims. He didn't do that to reduce their suffering. He did it because it made what he wanted to do easier and more enjoyable. In his own words, he didn't like people to move around when he had sex with them, and he did not want to have to reciprocate or do anything for them in any way. Drugging people was the easiest, least confrontational way he could accomplish what he wanted. Like all narcissists, Dahmer was not capable of truly taking responsibility for his own actions. Yes, he confessed and he admitted culpability, but upon watching his interviews, we see that there is some definite smugness in his demeanor, as if he enjoys shocking people and talking about these awful things. There's also quite a bit of blame shifting to circumstances and even to the victims. It seems that circumstances were always beyond his control. He was always drunk, and the victims were always at the wrong place at the wrong time, or they came on to him, or they just happened to be the perfect specimen for his fantasies, and after that, he just couldn't control himself. He would also answer questions obliquely at times, or seem not to understand the context of what was being asked, choosing to reply in a different context or to a slightly different subject. These are all manipulative tactics designed to avoid the things that he didn't want to say or didn't want to admit. He was very subtle and very non-confrontational, so you have to look closely to see it, but it is very definitely there. Now, there's often the question of how serial killers became the way that they are. While there's no real way to answer that question, it's very common to see abuse of some kind in their childhood history. With Dahmer, there's no evidence of overt abuse that has ever been made public, and he has never reported any. However, it's often speculated that his mother was a narcissist. Interviews with his parent that have aired on TV and that you can watch do seem to suggest there could be narcissism in the family environment. The father seems to have been ineffective and the mother domineering and overreactive, to say the least. This can create a situation where the child feels that they have nowhere to turn that's safe. They can become disconnected from the parents, from themselves, and from humanity in general as a result, especially because there's no outlet for their frustration, there's no support, there's no guidance. There is also some speculation that he received a few head injuries as a child as well, but like with all psychopaths, it's impossible to know if anything he's saying is actually true. He wouldn't be the only serial killer with a history of head injuries if it is true. Serial killers are preoccupied with fantasies of power and control, often because they feel powerless in their lives. Many of them were taught at an early age that the way to have power over others is through violence. Others perhaps learn this on their own as a result of an overly aggressive nature. Many of them have huge reservoirs of rage and hatred and pain, which fuel these violent fantasies and create a mindset that the world owes them, that they can take whatever they want, that they're allowed. If you combine that with the complete absence of empathy and a total disconnection from other people, you have a very dangerous person. As Ted Bundy once put it, when you have the power of life and death over somebody, you are God. Dahmer denies any rage, but at least one murder of his involved beating someone to death in a hotel room. He killed more than one victim with his bare hands, and his surviving victim, Tracy Edwards, described behavior that suggests Dahmer was not as tender and loving with his victims as he tried to claim he was. For example, Mr. Edwards stated during the trial that at one point, Dahmer listened to his heartbeat and then told him, "I'm going to eat your heart." This can be no less than an attempt to terrify somebody. This leads to cannibalism. Why did he eat parts of his victims? Power and control. This not only dehumanizes the victim to the point of being less than an object, they are now food, but it's a way of saying, I own you now. You are a part of me and you can never escape. His actual explanation was, it made them a part of me. Here again, if we hear that through our own lens of humanity, it could sound sympathetic or even endearing. Oh, he wants them to be part of him. But again, this is not a statement of anything other than ownership. It is a way to possess the person in every sense possible. It's the same reason he would cut holes in his victims' abdomens and have sex with that. You see how powerful I am, that I own every bit of you, I control every bit of you, and I can do whatever I want. None of this was ever about anything except his desire to control and own these other people. He has said the most exciting moment for him was whenever he lifted the person's body and their arms and head dangled backwards. He knew then that he was in complete control. After he would eat his victims' body parts, he would pleasure himself thinking about it. He freely admitted all of these things. That's all any of these people ever were to him, tools for masturbation. As human beings, as separate individuals, they did not matter at all. Dahmer, in many ways, was the quintessential psychopath, and he was at the apex of the danger scale. He was completely divorced from humanity in almost every sense. He was not a torturer per se, like so many others are, but only because the victims didn't even matter enough to hurt. He was completely indifferent to their feelings either way. We can even see this in his inability to understand or acknowledge that drilling a hole in someone's skull or pouring acid on their brain is torture. That creating sex zombies by erasing someone's identity completely against their will is torture. Who these people may have been, their lives, their loves, their families, their dreams, their goals, absolutely none of that mattered to him because they did not matter to him. That's the only reason why he wasn't a torturer. They were not important enough to torture. They were simply a means to an end. He cared about nothing, not even himself. When his body was examined after he was beaten to death by Christopher Scarver in prison, it revealed no defensive wounds at all. He never even put his hands up. Dahmer exemplifies the danger of projecting your own feelings onto a narcissist. Contrary to what some may believe, and even what he himself may have tried to imply, there was no remorse or meaningful humanity in this person of any kind. If we look with our eyes rather than our hearts and our feelings and our perception, we can see this very clearly. As Dr. Park Dietz famously said regarding serial killers, his orgasm is more important than your life. Jeffrey Dahmer is the personification of this quote. I hope you enjoyed our discussion about Jeffrey Dahmer. As always, I look forward to your comments, questions, and suggestions, so please keep those coming. We hope you will tune in next week when our subject is John Wayne Gacy. Until next time, take care.